Hi, everyone. Welcome to our engineering office here in San Francisco. I'm Vicky Cerullo, director of Bloomberg's Data for Good Exchange, and I'm just so excited that you all are here. You know, when we started the D4GX initiative about 6 years ago, this is exactly the community that we were looking to reach, to build, to connect for thought leadership, and exchange ideas. It's critical that we have these conversations with industry, academia, government, nonprofits, all of which are represented here tonight, which is so wonderful, who can collaborate to create change, whether it's here in the Bay Area, in New York City, where I live, and around the world. I'm especially grateful for our speakers tonight who are tackling an important topic, how data science is and can be used to address climate challenges, specifically around water. So, with that, hopefully you ate enough, you drank enough. There will be more after the program as well, so don't worry if you missed out on anything. But let's get to the program. I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Kate Gordon. Kate has an extensive bio that you have all read, so I won't go through the long list of her many accomplishments, but she really is amazing and has been at the forefront of climate action from law, city planning, academia, public-private partnerships, you name it. She's also collaborated with my boss, Mike, on a couple of things. Extra points there. But now as director of Governor Newsom's Office of Planning and Research, Kate is working on key initiatives here in California. As a former public official, I know the challenges of policymaking and the execution, which is sometimes more challenging. But if anybody can get things done, Kate can. So with that, if you would want to come up and share some of the great things that you've been working on.
Okay, I think this is on. Is this on? Yes. Thank you. What a nice introduction. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I always think it's a little odd to call something a keynote when you're talking to not that many people, all of whom are smarter than you on a particular subject. So this isn't really a keynote. This is sort of a discussion, conversation starter. I know a little bit about a lot of things, but all of you know more about data and how it's used in thinking about water, I bet, than I do. So I'm here to learn from you. I'm going to stay and listen to the panel after I talk as well, because I hardly ever get the chance anymore to learn things, so I'm excited. I have had a lot of experience thinking about the role that data plays in public policy. I think you can't do climate work without doing that. It's such a data-intensive world. And particularly, I should say, the thing that I worked on with Mike, I helped to found and lead what became the Risky Business Project, which was a project led by Mike Bloomberg, Hank Paulson, and Tom Steyer, with a number of other people, really looking to quantify the economic impacts of climate to the United States, and took a very intensive data approach. We actually, data geeks in the audience will like this fact that we used about 20 terabytes of data in the underlying research for the report, but then we had a communications layer and a messaging layer on top of that. And what we really did there was to say, at a very granular level, in very particular industries, commodity agriculture, energy demand, coastal infrastructure, and then health and labor impacts, what do likely and then tail risk climate impacts have across the United States? That still exists. The underlying work is now the underlying work of the Climate Impact Lab. So if you know those guys, that's all based on the Risky Business Project data. Rhodium was our contractor, and we made it an open source platform, and then they took it and they've commercialized parts of it. So, highlights, I think, both the importance of having unassailable underlying data, constantly updating it, making it open source if possible, but then translating it for people so that you can really turn it into something that policymakers can use. There's sometimes a big disconnect. We get people coming into our offices who say, well, the data said X, and sort of like, why aren't you doing something? And instead of really thinking, how am I going to package this so that it appeals to this person's constituencies, to this person's district, to this particular issue that's top of mind right now in the news? And I think that that's something that everybody needs to work more on. Policymakers need to work more on understanding the data, and data providers need to work more on speaking to policymakers. But I think we're getting better at this, and I'm very excited about the moment we're in. So I just want to talk a little bit about kind of stuff you probably know, but the impact of climate on water and what we're seeing in California now, a little bit about what California is doing in the water data space specifically, and then sort of set it up for the panel. So you all know this, but our climate is already changing, right? I mean, I have the pleasure and honor of being both the head of the Office of Planning and Research, which is essentially a think tank within the governor's office. If you know the federal system, we're a lot like CEQ is to the president, but we have a whole layer of land use work that we do as well, because we're at the state level. I'm also the governor's senior advisor on climate, so I have those two roles. And in those two roles, I spend a lot of time thinking about the fact that our climate is already changing. Temperature warming, of course, we're feeling that, and it's interesting coming from Sacramento to here just now. I got on the train in Sacramento, and it was 98 degrees, and I got off the train here, and it was whatever it is, 50-something. It's just an odd thing. So temperatures warming, we're having what they call flashier system of precipitation, which essentially means wetter and drier, right? So intense wet periods followed by intense dry periods. It's actually happening right now. So we had this very wet winter, and then that extended for a long time. The rainy season went on and on and on and on. And then we had those very scary, actually, days a couple weekends ago where it was windy and hot. And all of a sudden we had grass fires. And then what happens is all that vegetation that came into existence in the wet period all dried out in the windy and hot couple of weeks, and now is a fire hazard. We also have the flashiness also creates the problem of snowmelt, not this year, but in many years, is much sooner. And so the snowmelt is happening earlier. There may be less snow, and then the melt is happening earlier. It's evaporating faster. It's not going into the groundwater. It's creating all kinds of instability in our water supply. On average, snowpack is on the decline. There's a lot of research behind this, but I think the statistic that I look at the most is that by 2100, water supply from snowpack is expected to decline by 2/3 under business as usual, which is our current trajectory. And unfortunately, our current trajectory on climate policy is not California's current trajectory. It's the global current trajectory, which is not good. The severity of our drought, of course, a couple years ago was exacerbated by climate change. 2017, there were 5 disaster declarations related to flooding, winter storms, and mudslides, and then 2018 and 2019 have been the worst, or 2017 and 2018 have been the worst wildfire seasons. All of this is very, sounds very esoteric and far away, but I will tell you, the week before the governor started his job or 2 weeks was the Camp Fire, right? And then the week he started his job, PG&E declared bankruptcy. And then a couple weeks later, S&P and Moody's downgraded PG&E and the other 2 utilities because of fire liability, because they're looking at these same climate projections. So this is not a future climate impact conversation. This is the state is dealing today with the liability, with the risk, with the cost. I was on a conference call the entire way down here talking about this. This is the current situation for policymakers in California. Our office, I should say, ran the Catastrophic Wildfire Commission that just gave its report to the legislature. So we're very enmeshed in this conversation. So under our current practices, again, business as usual, which is a global number. California is only 1% of global emissions. We are looking at water shortages in vulnerable communities in particular. That is a big deal. On any given day, 1 million people in California don't have safe drinking water right now. And there are many days where people cannot get water from the tap when there are water shortages. That is a very significant impact on people's lives. Obviously, environmental damage, increased wildfire risk I talked about. Agricultural impacts are very significant in California. We have not only commodity agriculture impacts, which are significant on specific commodities. Actually, cows, which we have a lot of, are very heat sensitive. It takes cows about 6 hours to cool down after they overheat, and it's a long time. So if they don't have like a very cool night, that can affect milk production and a number of other things. But our specialty crops are very heat sensitive because it's not only how much you produce, like it's not only you get crop yield decline in things like grapes, the taste of the grape changes when the climate changes, and that changes the entire market for wine that you get from the grapes. So we're very, very climate sensitive in agriculture. Altogether, or I should say, actually, before I say that, energy demand is something we don't think about that much, but 20% of our carbon-free energy, electricity in the state comes from hydropower, which is very variable in times of water variability. And as I just have experienced, wildfire impacts affect our ability to meet our other clean energy goals. Our power purchase agreements for big clean energy from PG&E are now under threat because of PG&E's bankruptcy. That actually has a potential rolling impact on our ability to mitigate these risks. Altogether, about 93% of the climate impacts we feel in California are water-related in one way or another, so it's very significant. We're already, as I said, seeing unsafe drinking water, flood risk, fish population risk, all kinds of things. So what are we doing about this major issue that is very looming and present? A bunch of things. I mean, my office runs something called the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resilience Program, which is essentially kind of a vision for resilience in California. We have a technical advisory committee. We run an adaptation clearinghouse. We are the place that collects all the data from everybody else in the state and makes it available to people. So where are the maps? Where are the studies? How do we connect them all? And then how do we think, as the long-range planners of the state, how do we apply that when we're thinking about things like the general plan processes across the state, people's housing requirements, high-speed rail plans? Like, we're thinking about that overlay when we think about all of that infrastructure and built system, and about our natural and working lands and land preservation. How do we emphasize land preservation in order to be more resilient? California as a whole has a lot of data on water that is not very organized. If you've ever looked at an org chart, when I started my job, I never worked in California state government before, and when I started my job, I looked at the org chart, which is not for the faint of heart. It has many things on it. It said water is in like 17 of them, right? I mean, there's like agencies, and then there's commissions, and there's boards, and then, it's all over the place, and everyone has pieces of the decision, and they're all doing pieces of the data. It's very disjointed. It's very hard to integrate water management. There was AB 1755, the Open and Transparent Water Data Act, tries to start to align that. So we have a number of efforts right now to try to align these different sources of data to make them more accessible to everyone who needs to use them, including policymakers. That act is one of them. The Safe Drinking Water Data Challenge, which I encourage everybody to check out, is another one. That is sort of a crowdsourced data challenge, which asks participants to use an open data source and sort of upload information so we can start understanding what's available outside the state, along with what's available inside the state. And I can actually give you that URL, I think. Hold on, maybe I can't. I will find the URL for you.
Waterchallenge.data.ca.gov.
Look at that. It's like I'm...
Partnership happening.
It's like I'm in yeah, exactly. There you go. You should go to that, and I'm sure you'll be talking about it because it's really, really significant. And it allows for feedback and engagement. And I should say another place that we do a lot of engagement with people in the academic and private and NGO communities is in our climate assessments. So just like the federal government does climate assessments, looking at the climate impacts across a range of areas throughout the United States, we do climate assessments in California where we rely on a huge amount of outside expertise. So that the 5th climate assessment coming up in California next year will be another opportunity to engage. And then finally, Governor Newsom, one of his very few executive orders so far, he's done executive orders on fire and on health, and then he did an executive order on water, and essentially said to the entire administration, you guys need to figure out a better way to work together to figure out how to have a climate-resilient water system. We need to take all this data, and we need to take all these programs, and we need to take all these resources and money, and we need to align them under a comprehensive approach. And so what he's done is directed a number of agencies, specifically Resources Agency, the Farm and Ag Agency, and the Cal EPA Agency, to inventory and assess our water supply, our health of waterways, our demands and challenges, and then essentially ask them to come up with a set of actions to ensure safe and resilient water supply, flood protection, and healthy waterways. It's essentially he's saying, look, this bill is great about integration. This open source thing is a really important tool. We actually need you guys to tell us how we're going to fit all these things together and move forward to a more resilient system. And I will just say that Governor Newsom is very focused on climate resilience. It's one of the signature things that he's looking at. He's coming into a state where Governor Brown set up really, really impressive goals on climate mitigation. We have some of the best climate policy in the world in this state. We have incredible goals, carbon neutrality by 2045, incredible goals on renewable energy, incredible goals on zero-emission vehicles. Governor Newsom has come in and said, A, we need to go from ambition to action. We need to actually make this happen. And we need to make it happen throughout all of our existing systems, whether it's transportation, which we're actually failing on right now when it comes to emissions, whether it's water, whether it's our energy systems. Every investment we make has to have an underpinning of resilience. And we need to take a much harder look at what the future is going to look like as we kind of go forward, because some of these impacts are already baked in, and we need to take them seriously and not pretend that they're far off and unreachable. So I am really pleased and honored to work for a governor who is thinking about integrated systems. If you know him, you know he's a data geek, so he cares about you guys' stuff. He loves getting into the weeds, and he really, really cares about this issue. So I am excited about where we're going, but we need all of your help and engagement on making this better. So thank you, guys, for the opportunity and for everything you're doing.
Thank you so much, Kate. Really appreciate that. Good. It's a long trip from Sacramento, so we appreciate it. And just that stat, 93% of climate change impact in the state, being water related, just I think speaks to, the reason why we're having this discussion tonight. So without further ado, I just want to introduce our panel, moderated by David Baker, who covers energy and clean tech for Bloomberg News, right here. He's joined by Meredith Lee, who is the Executive Director of the West Big Data Innovation Hub, among many other things. We have Patrick Atwater, who's the Water Data Project Manager at ARGO Labs. And just quick note, unfortunately, Cheney was not able to make it tonight. He is working for the government as well. Things come up, but he's doing people's business. So he will not be here, but David, I'll kick it off to you. Get started.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for coming out tonight. California, obviously, water is a touchy subject for us even in the best of years. Right now, we've just had a really good winter. We're all feeling a bit better about that. But drought is never all that far away from us. I think all of you probably remember the drought that just ended a couple of years back, and seeing stands of trees die along the roadside because they hadn't had anything to drink in years. That is the reality that we are living with now. We are facing a scarier reality, I'd say, with climate change. And this in a state where we've been fighting about water issues since the state was founded. So what can we do with the data that is out there? What data is out there? And how are we doing getting it all corralled together in a usable form? I think that's where we should probably start tonight. Now, Ms. Gordon mentioned a really important law from a couple of years back, 2016. It was AB 1755, the Open and Transparent Water Data Act, which called on state agencies to put together a platform whereby all of the water agencies in the state could pool their data, use it, talk about it, share it, and they were supposed to do this by September of this year, 2019. Where do we stand in that process? Meredith, you want to take a whack at that?
Sure. Having just gotten off the phone with colleagues from Sacramento, folks are busy. They've been busy since the Open and Transparent Water Data Act passed. And looking at sort of the holistic view of what they started with, or what we as a community, really, it's an act that benefits so many people beyond the state government and the people who are looking to download off of data.ca.gov. There's really been a notable concerted effort to look at, what's the bare minimum that we need. We could put this up on a website, it's open, there it is. Or, maybe we can try to find some strategic alignment where, with everyone gathered around the table anyways and having this conversation, we can actually try to build something that is federated, more sustainable in the long run. And so I've been really, as a Californian, long time born and raised here, impressed by the level of collaboration in an area where, there have been wars fought about water. There's lots of movies about wars fought about water. And there isn't always, an easy alignment of interests, to put it interestingly. You guys all have wine, so you get the humor there. And so it's a hard job to actually try to corral all of the different pieces needed. And it's not just tech, it's people, it's culture of sharing data and trying to build things together. So are there any state government folks beyond Kate in the room who've been involved in opening up the data? None? They're all in Sacramento, very busy. Are there any folks in the room who have tried to use the data that the state is making available? All right, we've got some winners here. Yeah, I think it's a journey, and even though September 2019 is a milestone, they've really tried to look at the broader picture and see what would be sustainable beyond that date.
Are we going to have something useful by September?
I would say we've already started to have things that are useful. I see people who were involved in the California Safe Drinking Water Data Challenge who leveraged data that was open and machine readable for the first time last summer. They built, prototype apps. In many cases, there's folks who worked with school districts or impacted communities throughout the state and have started a conversation that will get us towards action, as Kate mentioned.
Patrick, what kind of data is there now, and how useful is it as someone who's taken a look at them?
So if anyone's ever used some of the open data portals that are in the broader civic technology community, it's kind of those types of things. There's the data.ca.gov, and then the California Natural Resource Agency has a similar one. There's data on urban water demand, there's data on fish counts, there's a lot of kind of whole universe of water data. And one of the pieces that I would note in terms of how useful it is that a lot of the key pieces of information that water managers are using to make decisions, so things that they are legislatively required to provide, things like their urban water management plans, or things like a lot of the data that's going into some of the key decisions about the Delta, what's happening in there right now. Those are still, if we really are honest about there's been a lot of really good progress with this kind of new digital approach. Much of the way that is done is still done by consultants and done by kind of legacy engineering firms. So to give you some context there was a lot of effort when AB 1755 was passed in terms of how will we fund this. And I think we've arrived at, there's some folks who know better, it's around ballpark $1 million a year to fund this. By way of comparison, there was over $500 million invested in the analysis of the Delta fix, which kind of gives you an order of magnitude. And then the water data challenge, which we participated last year, was around $25,000. So I think it's great things. I do think, though, what we really need to do is integrate some of these new approaches into the fabric of how many government decisions get made. So I've worked with a coalition of 14 California water utilities that serve around 23 million Californians. And that's because we have the largest one in the state and, in fact, the country. But there's thousands of little local water districts, and a lot of them, they don't necessarily have the technical capacity for a lot of this type of work, and they don't have a lot of, when they're doing things like their planning processes, they're, hiring a consultant to fulfill a demand and then trying to get it sent up to Sacramento. And then that data is usually, the data is still in a PDF. So we haven't really quite gotten to the point where, I would describe it as we've sort of layered on some good things there, but we haven't really kind of hit the point where better data is just the normal part of how we're making water management decisions.
Well, okay, think about this. If you were approaching it from sort of a clean slate kind of angle, what kinds of data, what points of data would we really need to have from everybody, every water agency in the state, in order to do good planning, not just at the local level, but at the state level? What kinds of information would we need to have? So how much water, where is it going, and to what purpose? And the state has a piece of legislation that was AB 1668, SB 606, which requires
a water budget approach, which is a way of saying, okay, how much water is going in there and then how much kind of should go in there. And this sets water budgets for all of the urban areas across the state. And a lot of this data is collected. It's just, as our previous speaker alluded to, the challenge is really not the data. The challenge is the history of California government, and we don't have the benefit of, a blank slate. We actually have, coming up to San Francisco Bay, we have, I think there's something like 10 feet of silt from the gold rush that lies on the bottom of the bay. It's kind of amazing when you think about it. It's an apt metaphor for all the layers that have accreted in terms of governmental units. And I don't know if you have any other thoughts.
Yeah.
You gotta love the metaphors. I've worked in federal government with data.gov and all of the different portals, whether it was for innovation for disaster response and recovery, or climate, or health. And back when I was at Stanford in academia, I sort of had this idyllic vision of this is how the government is doing all this, and it's designed well, and it's efficient, and good use of taxpayer dollars, and so forth. And then you get to DC, and you're like, wow, that's how the system works. And no one else is coming to help with this. Most people didn't realize that data.gov and all of the great launches that we had during the Obama administration was really 2 full-time employees and some contract help. And so you look at the magnitude of the challenge, and I glanced at the list, and I know Salesforce is here, and Facebook, and all of these great tech companies that have so much talent. This is a fantastic opportunity to, whether it's nights and weekends, or if you can convince, all the better for it, convince your core team at work to, enter something like an open data challenge, and maybe even think about sharing data that you might have that's useful that the state doesn't have. It's not, as Governor Newsom will be quoted in a press release tomorrow at 12 noon, stay tuned. It's not just the job of, the folks who work in government anymore. We need to have this holistic community problem-solving approach to try to tackle this. No one person, whether they have a background in law or engineering, data science, policy, is going to have all the answers.
Well, that's an interesting point that we were talking about. There's data that is collected automatically, and it's going to vary in the quality because you do have all these legacy systems that are sitting out there, and these are a lot of different districts. But I think the last figure I saw for California is more than 500 water districts, if you count all the mom and pops. And some of them really are mom and pops. They're small operations. They can't really afford to do anything beyond their core mission in any given year. Do we need to have some kind of crowd participation kind of project, therefore, in order to get the data in the first place out of these places that may not have an opportunity to upgrade their systems very often?
Yeah, there's a very interesting conversation happening about additional data streams that might be available. There's an electronic annual report that's required, but as you can imagine, looking once a year at data where many things are blank and they're not actually filled out, makes it very challenging to even discuss, how would you do real-time decision-making around specific issues. And so the State Water Resources Control Board, along with the West Hub and other partners, are actually going to be rolling up our sleeves and looking at the back end of some of this through a datathon in July as part of the challenge. But it's this continuous process. You're not going to be able to make that much progress despite, I invite you all to participate, but you have to realize that it's not going to happen on one Monday afternoon, and it takes a lot more discussion about how to build in those additional data streams and harmonize them with what systems exist.
To build on that, because I know one of the data points that the electronic annual report requires is just what is the price of water across the state, which is actually also collected in a couple of different other places, which it's like around 400 major and then like 1,000. But like all those water districts, they just love, because they love just getting asked the same question. Like if you had to get asked, fill in the same data entry worksheet over and over again. No one likes doing that. But one of the things that we did for last year's water data challenge was putting together kind of an open and machine readable data specification for pricing, which is important because then you can actually know what is the price of water. And that's a real opportunity for community collaboration. And it's also really important because like the way the electronic annual report is set up right now, it doesn't let you put in, like if you're trying to have with the kind of water budget framework that I was talking about, where you're trying to benchmark an efficient use of water. So you have kind of conflicting with other legislative requirements. And one of the kind of looking on the optimistic side of the ledger, one of the really big opportunities with our new governor is, as the previous speaker alluded to, there's been a lot of exciting action related not just to water, but how it touches on fire, and these things all connect. So when you're looking at the way that we're going to develop water budgets statewide, a key piece of that is looking at aerial imagery to see what are the water requirements of urban areas across the state. And there's also some looking, Governor Newsom's executive order was looking at how we're procuring things for fire management. And if you really think about it, it's kind of radically common sense because you're talking about urban water, the way suburbs buttress, like a hillside in Southern California or up in Sonoma where you've had all these fires. There's not like a magical line that divides these things. And the kind of shift to where you have a mindset where it's like, hey, let's try to open this up and let's try to have a more community-based reform some of the procurement of this, because a lot of this ends up being pretty black box. It's really encouraging to see the governor has been a very big champion on this. Actually, I wrote a whole book about it. Yeah.
So is there any, you mentioned some of the very basic stuff like how much is being used, what's the cost, what is the use that it's going out for? Are there any key points of data that we are not collecting that you think really could help?
Well, groundwater is the easy one, but that's kind of in the process.
We're going to get there.
Yeah.
We don't have enough time, David, to discuss all of this. There is the thought that you can't improve what you don't measure, and then some things are really hard to measure. So I think the important part, in looking at the legislation and the framework and everyone, all of the collective resources and brain power in the room is, having more people look towards civic engagement. And civic engagement isn't just voting or running for office. As much as those are great things, there's so much that you can do on a day-to-day basis in terms of partnering and working on projects. I was shocked with data.gov that there wasn't actually any measurement of who is using the data that people are spending so much time making open. There's like a very simple star rating system potentially, or maybe there's GitHub portals around where you can sort of track, engagement. But I think that's a start, because we need to, as a community, have some of those success stories of the people who've been working on this data set and maybe even started a company on it or teach an entire class using it. But sometimes that doesn't bubble back up to Sacramento or any of the decision makers that might be able to provide more data. So I think usage of the data is a key thing to consider.
So on that kind of theme of usage, one radically common sense idea that's kind of been our dream with the California Data Collaborative, which doesn't have the word water in it, but which is getting not just metered water usage data, so actual water usage at the end user level, so like whether that's a building like this or a house or what have you, but like integrate that with electricity, natural gas. And while we're dreaming, it'd be really cool to have, you can do some nifty things with sensors for trash and things like that. So that would be very nifty in a very radically common sense way to be able to start to integrate and start to think creatively, okay, we're trying to use less natural resources. That's kind of the really not rocket science part of all of this is if water is going to be increasingly scarce with climate change, makes sense to be more efficient with what we have. And then there's also ancillary benefits where you have to less energy to move it, and then you can also start to talk about, there's the embedded water and energy and all the other pieces that are going into your home or a building or whatever. If you have all that linked up, we can start to get all sorts of brilliant people finding those efficiencies.
You mentioned a minute ago groundwater. That's definitely something that I wanted to ask about.
Right.
Obviously, during the recent drought, that was a very touchy issue, and you had parts of the Central Valley sinking. They sink a little bit anyway on a given day, but really sinking to the point where bridges were cracking. What kind of data do we actually currently collect on groundwater supplies, levels, usage, and what do we need?
So I'm not an expert on SGMA, which is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. I would note part of it is it kind of goes back to the point where there's a whole set of water rights that have been developed for the history of California, going back to the gold rush. I mean, the data point that I would say that really makes it kind of different is that when you look at the severity of our drought and you look at the trends with climate change, I mean, I think some of the things that are really coming down the pipeline are how you could potentially renegotiate some of those rights, because there's going to be really serious issues.
And also on the academic side, I think there's a lot of really interesting avenues for emerging technology to better measure, at much closer time intervals than what is, currently out there. And so I sit at UC Berkeley, but, we partner with universities across the entire region, and there is this shared group through the National Institute of Water Resources and a number of different centers. The UC system has done a lot of work in trying to look at specific use cases and really highlighting what can be done in terms of measurement and monitoring. So there's a lot to be done there from people who, aren't a .gov email holding person.
Same question in terms of water quality. Ms. Gordon mentioned that, although it shocks a lot of people to hear, we do have persistent problems with water quality in various parts of the state. What kind of monitoring, what kind of data is available right now for that people could actually take a look at?
Well, there's all sorts of things on the State Board website. To throw out one controversial thing, I mean, some of the things that we should be looking at is some of those, the underlying issue is they are like the smallest of the mom and pop types of districts, and we should be looking at their financials and their management structures, and some of those should be put into kind of like regional consortiums or consolidated with larger districts. Because, I mean, if you're not able to provide, health and human services, there was LA County put one, it's like Centeva Water District into receivership, and those are the types of things we need to be looking at.
I mean, you would argue that you should be able to pinpoint somewhere in California and say if there's a water contamination issue, where's upstream where, that could be coming from. And when we had a group of students looking at that, it was, amazing how many things needed to be done to integrate the systems to actually be able to have, let's drop a pin here and see at any given point, if you sort of looked at a way back time machine, let's say that the problem was, on Monday, what was sort of flowing in at that point. And so that's an ongoing effort. There's also a huge opportunity to look at premise plumbing. I know you all came here on a Tuesday night to talk about plumbing, but I mean, think about the overarching ecosystem. You've got state-supplied water, reservoirs, wells, et cetera, and then at some point, there's the apartment building or the school and so forth that, we don't have any data in most cases about that, but yet that is directly affecting the water quality for the human, consumer. So the more we can look at the holistic system and think about all the different places where you could leverage sensor technology, you could leverage data sharing platforms to be able to answer those simple questions of, what was the water quality at this latitude and longitude on this day?
You mentioned the word opportunity in there. We all, I think, tend to think of water issues first from a government point of view or NGO point of view more than a business point of view, just because of the way the system works in the United States. But for the people in the audience here who might be looking for business opportunities in all of these streams of data we're talking about, do you see any areas that look like business opportunities to you?
That's kind of my job, to look at opportunities across different sectors. So I see opportunities in my sleep. We work at the West Big Data Innovation Hub across industry, academia, nonprofits, and government. And we try to provide this neutral place for people to ask those questions of how might we? And often the answer to the how might we is, oh, we need to bring in so-and-so to the table. In terms of business opportunities, I think there's this tension sometimes, especially in the Valley here, of sort of bottom line business opportunity and then some of the equity and inclusion and elements where there actually is a business opportunity if you frame it and you do your business model canvas in the right way. I think the ecosystem is ripe for some of those companies to really take a leadership role. We had the Global Climate Action Summit here in San Francisco. We hosted the Water Pavilion and had great brainstorming exercises. And the question is, well, are you going to have a Global Climate Action Summit every year, or are we actually going to roll? And yes, the answer was no immediately. It was a big lift. It's hard to get Harrison Ford and Edward Norton was at our Water Pavilion event and so forth. But, asking the question of how might we, whether you're wearing your business hat, whether you're wearing your neighborhood, parent, whatever hat you're wearing, is so critical, because you often think of it in the negative and this is a problem and let's try to bury our head or whatnot, and someone else will solve it. But what if there wasn't someone else coming?
Food. I think we talk about urban waters being 20% of human consumption, but it's actually, cities are where most of the people eat most of the food, and meat is still incredibly water intensive. There's already a ton of things going on there. One of the really exciting things, and this was our first and he was doing this kind of more as a labor of love, but our first advising statistician for the California Water Data Collaborative. His day job was the head of R&D for this. He would introduce himself very casually as as a maggot farmer. So he was doing high volume insect production, which helps preserve a lot of the complex proteins that you've built up with water. And because if you take food, feed it to a maggot, then you can use the maggot to feed it to a pig, as opposed to if you go to compost, you actually break it down a lot more. So that's kind of interesting. But food is a whole big area. Going to be more.
Well, you were saying that you'd love to have somebody be able to build this giant complex model where you can see all these inputs and outputs and garbage falling and all that, and food would fit into there. What would be to you a killer app that someone could design around water data that you just think would be a holy grail of sorts?
There already is the app. It's not the issue is more adoption. There's a bunch of these apps where you can see your usage on your phone. It's why isn't every Californian able to do that? And the answer is because of the zillions of water districts. That there's just so much fragmentation. But it's 2019. It should be sort of there are operating practices where it's you get a paper bill in the mail. We should evolve so that there's this opportunity to more folks.
So the mobile dashboard?
Yeah, or whatever. I don't know, I'm a millennial, however you want it. The web.
Meredith, how about you?
I guess if I would go all meta and have this magic wand of magic app, really looking at, learning from history, and obviously there's so many people probably in the room that are into machine learning or prediction, but being able to see what intervention, whether it was a policy change or whether it was, stronger community engagement for this specific case study in the Central Valley, or any number of things, and seeing impact over time and the different players and organizations that helped make things happen. It's essentially sort of like a storytelling type of, impact storytelling magic wand app. We had a team, Rosanna and Olivia and Sean from Berkeley, who met at a hackathon as part of the Water Data Challenge, and their project was visualizing voices. And it sort of had that theme of looking in the media and seeing coverage from the Community Water Center, other nonprofits, community, sort of engagement, and seeing what voices might have been missing. And looking at the stories of, here was a policy that was introduced, and then this happened, and trying to stitch together, behind the magic curtain type of thing. I think that type of ecosystem view would be really helpful. I mean, the past might not repeat itself. There's all sorts of different factors, but if you can look at things from that holistic view, we might be able to draw some insights that are different from when you've got, a very specific case.
Have you seen any particular ideas or projects that really surprised you around this, where you saw it and like, wow, I never thought to try to do that with this information?
Takes a lot to surprise me sometimes. So we work on so many different things, but I think what was surprising for us when we started on this adventure with the governor's office and all of the different data stewards was, the number of collaborators and partners who wanted to chime in. We decided to just, keep it easy and create a Google form for people to raise their hand and commit to different opportunities, whether it was hosting a hackathon, which, by the way, is open for 2019, calls for hosting hackathons and so forth, to, someone offered shower heads as prizes. Like, that was kind of surprising. I think when you have that open to all, and even though it was called the California Water Data Challenge, we had people working on projects who were from New Mexico, who were from Utah, and parent and son and daughter teams coming together. Those surprised me more than, say, like the technological approaches, the consideration of which stakeholders could engage and trying to have productive conversations that went well beyond the summer.
Have you seen any ideas out there that you thought that just took you completely by surprise?
I mean, I think the piece that's kind of not by surprise, but it's just how connected water data is to other areas. I mean, so when we were doing our work on, the water budget statewide, you have to get parcel data because you need to know what's residential, what's commercial, what's industrial. And we got that data from OPR. You see all the issues with that data statewide. So I was really surprised with that about just kind of the state of land use data across California, which is a big challenge. Which is an understatement. There's just trying to get very basic, like parcel level data across the state is a huge challenge. There's actually, I think it's around like 8 to 10 counties with a system of record is actually the vendor that does it. So it's very much a little bit kind of inside baseball.
So at this point, you mentioned that you were getting people coming in from other states. Are there any other states that are doing a better job of this than California? I mean,
we're live recording, right?
It's like to think that we're at the start of these things, but we may not be.
Yeah, California has the, Human Right to Water bill. There's a lot of firsts for California, but there are so many states that, have some really great initiatives and are interested in going more regional. And so, we're part of a national network funded by the National Science Foundation and other partners. And so there's a lot of discussion on sharing best practices. Often to date, it's sort of boiled down to, well, that state's pretty different because of this policy landscape, or, sometimes if there's less legacy infrastructure and you're not as big as the state of California, like, oh, well, they were able to do that because of X. And that's the same whether you're talking about water data or health data or smart and connected communities at a broader scale. I would say that I don't want to call out anybody right now, but there are some great folks who have worked on open data, but also like data where you have restricted access, but the government decision makers and so forth now have a better internal system. And so as we look at scaling local and state successes more broadly, that dynamic of how did you get that culture for, it's not just all open data, but you're actually internally doing a better job of stuff that may never see the light of day because it's security sensitive or whatnot. So yeah, I'm gonna dodge that question a bit, David.
I'll dodge, but it'd go international. Let's say Australia.
Yeah.
Australia is they're also really. Israel's fascinating. They get them young, like they from cradle to like all the way up. They have a whole ethic of you must save water, save water, save water. Australia
Pre-K to gray.
Yeah, exactly. Which honestly is kind of ultimately where I think a lot of this can kind of come in, where you think of a lot of the tools and technologies that we're leveraging in this data space. It's some of the things that are common sense around here for like Facebook and what have you, and it's how do you make those kind of behavioral nudges, which is where I think we can start to kind of build the ethic that Israel has already. And the reason I was saying Australia, they have a really, some of the ambitions with AB 1755 are kind of towards a water market, and they have, my understanding, I'm not an expert there, but a very successful water market. And also when they had their Millennium Drought, they did a lot of the hard work to simplify their management so they didn't have so many water districts.
We're going to go to questions from the audience here in a moment, but before we did, one last quick question for each of you. This can be a very daunting and depressing topic when you think about the size of the challenge. Are you optimistic we're going to solve this? And do you think data will get us there? Meredith?
Before this, I also worked in, counter human trafficking and national security and many other things. So, it does take a mindset to stay optimistic when, any of the factoids that Kate rattled off are just like, oh, wow, we're screwed, aren't we? And so I think we have to be optimistic and trying to build that network between collaborators on, what's really driving you to make an impact in this space, and understanding that it's not all sunshine and rainbows and unicorns. There's some really difficult challenges in working around this. We didn't really get to talk about it that much here, but the last time I was at the Bloomberg Data for Good Exchange event in San Francisco, we were looking at, what a code of ethics for data scientists might look like, and all of the responsible data science questions that naturally should be part of the conversation around this. And so, it's not for the faint-hearted in some sense, but there are also these small steps that we can take to engage folks, even if they're new to data science and don't necessarily have all the context. We can together provide a way to make this an engaging avenue for exploration.
Patrick, how about you?
So let me say emphatically, data will not solve California's water challenges. I would say, conversely, though, it's hard to imagine a world where we do meaningfully prepare and adapt if we're not actually seriously improving our data and we have good data about how water is used, when, where, to what purpose. Where I'm most optimistic is that we have a governor who's championed and there's going to be an Office of Digital Innovation that's going to help not just in water, but kind of broadly. I think a lot of the longstanding planning aspirations that we've had, when you look at the kind of communications frictions between different layers of government, what's really exciting there is that really common sense things in terms of collaboration and the way you kind of might expect your government to work, we'll be able to kind of nudge things in that direction. And I'm actually very optimistic about that. And seeing the people that are involved and seeing like who's in charge, I think that'll be very good.
Excellent. Well, let's open it up. Does anyone have any questions for our panelists up here? And I think this is a small enough room that you can just stand up and shout it out.
Of course it's Kate.
So I have a question about overcoming the disincentives for data sharing, which they're substantial like a lot of them, right? Is it a concept where people don't want to share that they haven't used all their water rights because they might lose them? You know, you don't have to tell anybody how much groundwater is on your land now, so why should you, right? Like, so even with changes in legal status, there are disincentives to sharing data, not just in water, but other natural resources. So how can either innovations in data collaboratives or ways to share and process data create incentives for transparency? How can we reward people for sharing data that might potentially make them look bad if they don't share it or not make it?
So I can speak to the kind of the story of how our, data collaborative, which dealt with, customer level data, which is private and is securely shared through an NDA. And state regulations are a powerful motivator, and in trying to get ahead of that is a powerful motivator. I would also say that when you're investing, better part of $500 million in cash for grass rebates and trying to get good numbers because you have the press hounding you about what was the amount of water saved, those are powerful motivators. I do think a lot of this, it takes sort of enlightened self-interest. And I think this is why I'm optimistic about the Office of Digital Innovation and things like that, is I think we have enough of these sort of early successes and pilots. And if you have leadership from, say, the right governor who likes this kind of stuff, then you could start to say, well, hey, let's just kind of go down the list, and we need a data collaborative for housing because we need good data on that. We need one on fire management. We need one on all these other areas. Plastics in the oceans, I know it's something we've talked about, is another big issue. And so it takes a multi-pronged approach to kind of, move the immovable object.
Yeah, it's an iterative, very cyclic process. And so the more we have leaders who are willing to be transparent about where, they had specific challenges and they learned and they were able to, shape the trajectory so it wasn't this like horrible disaster that you then like never want to speak of or ever have in the news, but like, hey, take Michael Wilkening being able to say that, the procurement process was a disaster for Health and Human Services, and I acknowledged that, and then I realized that, there was something that we could do about it, and it took working together and an open stance to change in order to make that happen. So if you have people who are willing to tell that story, I think we have a much better shot at aligning those incentives. At the end of the day, we like to say, collaboration moves at the speed of trust. And so if you don't have that trust, at time equals zero, hopefully you'll get somewhere. Well, you guys are looking this way, time equals zero, and you'll get somewhere where you've got enough of the trust to cross that threshold and really collaborate and not just cooperate lightly.
Any other questions out there?
I'd like to push the conversation a little bit to the latter part of the data to understanding to action part of it. So if we take the Safe Drinking Water Challenge, for example, and the set of resources that were underneath there, quite a bit helped us understand the quality of our water or the lack of quality. It's not clear that there is much thinking went into, are we seeding the conversation about what mitigation steps, what actions to take in response? If you worked hard, you could tease it apart. You could, if you fused it with census data, you could determine, if you're lower socioeconomic status or minority, it wasn't that you're more likely to have a contaminated drinking water, but if it was contaminated, it's much more likely that it stays for a long time and that did the trucks roll? What actions are taken or not taken around the data that you're looking at? I think Meredith touched on, upstream, okay, yeah, this is water, or waste, but all of the actions around that water, those aren't part of the data, right? And is that part of the conversation about what we'd really like to do is to get the conversation started? Yes, you're most likely to experience contamination of arsenic in Kern County. That's, of course, where mining takes place. So are we having the conversation about the relationship of mining and water, or agriculture and water, that the underlying data is servicing, but it's not really leading us to talk about the mitigation steps?
When you're still trying to get the data, it's often easy to focus just on getting the data and not on what gets done with it. So are people at the state level trying to act on the data that's there?
Or to see to us to understand how we might act or how they might.
Yeah, going from the what to the so what, and the magic wand or app that tells you this was the intervention that you did and the cascading effects, and if I had done it this way, would I have had a better impact? So full disclosure, David is my manager and supervisor, but we didn't plant that question. No. It is about raising those questions, right? And having worked in government, I have a lot of empathy for answering the mail and doing all these things where there's so much going on, literally fires happening and fire drills all the time. And so the more we can have, forums like this, where whether it's Bloomberg hosting or other folks, so that we raise those questions and say, well, can we answer this? And if the answer is not really so well right now, well, how might we get to that point? And that's where the engagement with, fresh ideas and folks who are coming at this from different angles is so critical, because you don't know what questions aren't being asked.
David, can I just
Please.
Please.
and say, not answer it because it's a great question, but something that would be helpful. I think some of this stuff isn't integrated because of the different agencies. And water is particularly challenging in California because it has multiple layers of legal structure, as you probably know. But your question, for instance, about mining and the impact, what would be incredibly helpful to us or to me as a policymaker would be somebody coming in not just saying, well, have you thought about the impact of mining on this, but to say, here's what we've learned about these activities in this place, and here's the impact we think might be going on, and here's what we think, here's a way to ramp that down that would actually solve this problem. Do you know what I mean? So what we get a lot of is people with very specific, like it's a siloed advocacy world and a siloed state policy world. And it would be very helpful to have a more integrated advocacy world to come with solutions that kind of bring in some of the data. Like, in Kern County, Kern County is our most mining dependent county by far. And that's a job creator, and it's an economic driver, and it's very culturally embedded. So you can't just shut it off. You have to come with sort of an idea of, okay, how do these things relate? Who are the stakeholders? What does doing this over here do to this over here? And having that conversation a little bit with a more integrated approach on both sides would be very helpful.
And there is also at the state level, I think Cali EPA and Natural Resources wanted to put together a California Water Data Consortium, right? You would have state level people plus NGOs plus people working just in the data field, all talking over these issues together, so that you could have that kind of discussion while you're still trying to get the data together in the first place. So.
Yeah, I was part of the advisory council for that, and so sitting next to, the farm stakeholders and the Bureau, and then the Earth Genome folks looking at lessons learned, and so many different people coming together and seeing, how might we streamline a few first steps towards collaboration so that we can help empower people to not just raise the question, but also, here's an initial data analysis. Let's start to have the conversation. To be fair, David volunteered to mentor a few students to do that and send a report to the state. But, it can't just be one person and one group at a university. We really need to do this across the state. And so that's why we're excited to, continue the Water Data Challenge and encourage more people to have this substantive analysis.
Let's take one more if we've got one out here. Someone? There's someone way in the back there. That would be you.
Sort of a comment you talked about, wanting to empower tech companies to use this data, provide data. So I had a couple. We're working from that space. Some of the challenges and comments and questions that I have to you are one is privacy as far as providing data, which you touched on. Another thing that we've really is quality and standardization. That is sort of 2 points, 500 different models. So certainly, as good as the descriptions are for data that you're providing, it is different to different people. So you're not consistent data. And then from a business standpoint, wanting to work as a viable business in more than just California is doing, but trying to work across other states. Data across other states is very difficult. So I'm interested in what California and other states on helping solve that. That's my main question. But on the flip side, also, one of the things I'd be interested in, we're in the Silicon Valley, we love data, we're all data geeks. Great, we've analyzed all this data, that now we provided a solution. Getting utilities or other conservative industries to take that data and really take action on it. How can California help connect those?
So there's a couple of questions. I'm not sure, Kate, if you want to mention what California is doing with other states. I can say from the West Big Data Hub and the network of big data hubs funded by the National Science Foundation, there's a lot of interest in leveraging the existing ecosystems like the National Institutes for Water Resources, where there's multiple regions, and trying to look at standards and best practices, norms that could cut across state boundaries. Take disaster response and recovery as one example where, something that happens, whether it's, wildfire or drought, it's not going to stop necessarily right at a, county boundary, state boundary, and so forth. And so there's a level of regional or national coordination that is a particular pain point there that causes people to have the conversation. And to be fair, there's often, having worked with FEMA and other groups, there's this, can we pretend like we've all tried to coordinate this before and leverage what we did before, the previous disaster? So it's definitely a work in progress.
We're part of a number of coalitions, right? We're part of the Pacific Coast Collaborative, which is all of the Pacific Northwest states plus British Columbia. We're part of the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is 25 states now, over 60% of the economy, actually. And we're part of the Under 2 Coalition, which is subnational regions around the world. So all of those are opportunities. With the PCC, the Pacific Coast Collaborative, we're doing actual, data sharing. We're actually sharing our firefighting services. They're very specific things we're doing. And then U.S. Climate Alliance is a little bit more policy sharing. And then internationally, we're talking to Australia about their wildfire policy and stuff like that. We also, those who were at the Global Climate Action Summit, which we will not do again this year, heard Jerry Brown promise to have, as we call it in California, the damn satellite. So the satellite is, I inherited the satellite when I started my job. And we are looking into a California-supported satellite that originally was to look at methane emissions, but we're actually realizing it will be probably much more useful for things like vegetation management and other things that are sort of related to some of what we're talking about here. And the idea behind that is actually a platform that would be widely shared. So we are looking at trying to create some, especially as the federal government steps back from a lot of data. There are a lot of subnationals and national governments around the world that are trying to fill that gap. So that is something we're looking at.
Very cool.
Yeah, satellites.
Are our partners in the West Coast Alliance, are they going to help fund the damn satellite, or is it still on us?
It's a little, who knows? Okay. We're so far not putting any, I'm happy to say to all you taxpayers, we're not putting any state money into the satellite at this point. It's actually all privately funded today.
To your question though, there's a whole wealth of other data that's being NYU GovLab is cataloged there's hundreds of these data collaboratives around the globe where people are pooling data across both public entities like our little water data collaborative and others across the globe. There's actually one idea that our little data team has been dreaming about is that things like the Under 2 MOU. It's why isn't data sharing part of that? Because those are things where you could some of it is already public, but particularly for things where, your point about data security and privacy, where you can have differential privacy, because there's really no reason we should want to have, the best and brightest from around the world, like academics having access to, applied social science research data, like end user customer data, like the UK, New Zealand, there's a bunch of examples where that's happened, and be really cool and also really helpful as you're trying to figure out what are the most cost-effective ways to incentivize lower usage and what have you.
Well, I think I'm getting the flag over here to wrap things up. So thank all of you for attending, and we will be hanging out here for a little bit. So if you have other questions or comments, feel free to come on by. And thank you very much for being here. Thank our panelists too.
Thank you so much, David, our speakers, our panelists. We just hope that the conversation doesn't stop here. It continues. So, so many great issues were raised and, talking about how we can, move forward and come up with more solutions. So stay, as David said, connect with each other, join our LinkedIn group. You could speak to Chaim if you want some more information on that. And for anyone who will be in New York City in the fall, our 6th, I can't believe it's the 6th, D4GX conference will be held on Sunday, September 15th. The theme for that to talk about what are we doing globally, it's around data science for the SDGs, so the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we've actually just extended our call for papers to Thursday, June 20th. So you still have time if you want to submit something. You can find out all of the information on our website. Just please do so before 11:59 p.m. Co-chair of our program committee is here, Srijit. And actually, Meredith is serving on our program committee this year, so thank you, Meredith. And so, thank you so much for joining tonight, and hope to see you around soon.